Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Peden, and I am not mixed. In fact, if you put me next to a tub of sour cream, you couldn't tell the difference, but I am here guest hosting today's episode of Mixed Chicks Chat on April 7th, 2010. Mixed Chicks Chat, the only live weekly show that discusses everything about multiracial, multicultural identity, and just about everything in between. We will get to our guest, Stephen F. Riley, momentarily, but first we have a few announcements to make. The first one is a film screening at Columbia and conference at Harvard coming up this weekend, Friday and Saturday. There's a free film screening of Mississippi Masala, a noteworthy example of intercultural romance as seen through Hollywood's lens. The screening will be followed by a discussion about the cultural issues raised by the film. Loving Day founder Ken Tanabe will moderate the discussion. It's at Columbia University, Lunner Hall, room 569, 2920 Broadway at West 115th Street. And then there will be a free conference at Harvard the following day at the Harvard University campus, hosted by the Harvard Half Asian Peoples Association. Lectures will be given from professors at Harvard College, Harvard Kennedy School, Divinity School, and Tufts University. So a lot of things are going on as we start April, and there will also be a gala dinner at this conference honoring Kip Fulbeck, one of our previous guests. It's $7 for students, $15 for others, so if you're in the Harvard area, please stop in. Also, you may notice, why am I guest hosting? Well, one of our hosts, Heidi Duro, is currently touring the country to promote her book, The Girl Who Fell from the Sky. It's moving up the charts on the bestsellers list. It's a great book. I finished it this weekend. If you're looking to explore some issues on multiracial identity, it's a great book and a great way to look at some of the issues that even now are still prevalent, but she is on tour, so she can't come here, but you can pick up The Girl Who Fell from the Sky at your local bookstore or online at Amazon.com. And, of course, we have the Mixed Roots Film and Literary Festival upon us. The submission deadline has passed, so if you have anything you wanted to submit, unfortunately, they won't be able to include it for this year's festival, but you can still go to their site, register, and find out what will be featured. Their website is mxroots.org. That is mxroots.org. And you can also find information to send a donation, because the support is all donation run. And by doing that, it allows Fanchen and Heidi to host the festival at no charge to all our guests. So we'd like to thank everyone here for joining us today. And now we'll bring on our guest. Silver Spring Steve is his username, but his real name is Stephen F. Riley. He is part of the mixedracestudies.org. In fact, he's the sole operator of the site for now. He uses the site to post scholarly material on the multicultural and multiracial experience, and one of his goals is to ultimately support a vision of the irrelevance of race, but we'll bring him on to talk more about that. He's one half of an interracial marriage for 25 years, and he's a big Doctor Who fan, so let's bring him on.
Hello.
Hello, Steve.
Hello,
I
Mike.
see you're on, and that's always a good sign, and we'd like to thank our guests for tuning in. So I know you've listened to this show before, so you probably have had some training, but I'll ask this question anyway.
Okay.
When someone comes up to you and asks you, what are you, how do you respond?
Well, for this particular broadcast, I think the answer would be I have been racialized as a black American man.
Well, the great thing about that question is that there's no right or wrong answer, and so thank you for sharing that with us. And so let's get started with this site. You just celebrated your first anniversary, and so what was the inspiration for you to post scholarly material and other expert resources on the multicultural experience?
Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that I found that there was a real shortage of in-depth discourses in the media, especially in newspaper articles, TV, broadcast news reports. And it just was really superficial. And I had a real problem, there was no historical perspective in any of the articles. There was no there was no international perspective either. So there was no mention of the fact that, hey, things are like this in Brazil or other countries. So I decided to do some searching on my own, and while searching on the internet, I discovered Mixed Chicks Chat, this show right here. And I have to, before I go on, I should really thank Heidi and Fanchen for allowing me the opportunity to be on the show, and also thanking you for being the host. Also, so anyway, what I really found interesting about Heidi and Fanchon show was the only show of its type on the internet, and I really found it just very interesting. And then what I discovered is essentially, I said, well, if those two women can do this program, this excellent program, then maybe I can do something like that, something similar. So I decided to launch my own site, and then, as a way to help myself personally learn more about the topic and maybe help other people. So after that, the next step was to pick up a copy of scholar Jane Afekwunegwe's book called Mixed Race Studies, and I read it, and it just started from there.
All right, and before I start with the next question, I should let all of our listeners know if you want to submit a question to Steve, you can type in through the TalkShoe application, or in the case of one of our guests, we can call and bring you on the air. So don't be afraid to ask him a question, and we'll get that on the air. And so you mentioned this lack of resources, because it seems like you and I personally had a similar parallel, or discovered a similar parallel, because if you're not familiar, I produced a documentary called What Are You? A Dialogue in Mixed Race, because when I looked up mixed race on Google or other search engines, I agree with you, you really didn't find a lot of information available on this experience. And so
it all depends on where you look. So where
do you look if you're looking to enlighten yourself?
First thing I started to do is I looked at journal articles. So I started looking at Sage publications, Routledge publications. I also looked at university presses. And once you get there, my philosophy is sort of follow the scholars. You instead of looking for terms like mixed race or multiracial, I looked for terms like Dr. Maria Root or G. Reginald Daniel, Rainer Spencer, and then you find out more and more articles, and then you can search on the terms. And I just started that, and I started collecting collecting more links and adding them to my website, and it went from there. And
it's interesting you mentioned those guests too, because they were guests on this show, and I know like when we had Rainer Spencer on, and Reginald Daniel, I believe, was on here too, you would often have lengthy discussions with these guests after the show. And so maybe you can tell us, what did you learn from them, and how have they helped you shape your site?
Well, when I first started I read the anthology Mixed Race Studies, and I would highly recommend that the listeners, if they really want to jump into the study of mixed race issues or multiracialism, they should pick up an anthology, because you get sort of a taste of the different authors out there and the different scholars. So the first book I tried to get actually was Rainer Spencer's Spurious Issues, and it's called Spurious Issues in Multiracial Identity Politics in the United States. And I had difficulty getting the book from Amazon at first, so I just simply sent him an email message. And what I discovered, he was quite friendly and really was helpful. And then from there on, I felt like I could contact just about any scholar I wanted to ask about ask any question, and went from there.
Now you submitted a quote-unquote press release on your first anniversary, and in this is pretty impressive if you're new to his site. You have 400 articles, 300 books, over 100 papers, reports, dissertations on this site that make up your 1,000 posts. So why don't you tell us, that people who have stumbled upon your site or have found it, what have they told you about it, or what do they think when they see this massive resource of material, which is only expanding?
Well, what surprised me at first was that I set the site up for people who are non-academic. So that was my intention, was essentially attract them and lead them, present a gateway to scholarly material. To my surprise, I find that there are a fair amount of scholars out there who come to the site. And what I've heard so far is there are people who have found resources that they did not know that existed. There are other people who have who have said this are really great resources. I had a professor from California who said that he and his colleague were going to create a database like mine over at the University of California, but they simply didn't have the budget to do that. And for people who do want to know, am I funded? This is this is a complete labor of love. For me to host this is about $10 a month. So I may work on the site maybe an hour or two a night. So it's a labor of love, and I really like doing it. I really enjoy it, and I learn a lot from it.
And also, speaking of, you're not the only person who likes doing this. You mentioned one of your future goals is to get a redesign of your layout with your wife, who is listening today and reminding us of the date, April 7th, 2010, for those of you who just tuned in. So what are your plans to update the site, and what are your goals with it? Like, what is this big redesign going to look like when the Internet followers sign in?
Well, what will happen, what I hope to do is first of all, have my wife, Julia Cates, who's a real inspiration, and also...
And we did not pay him to say that, ladies and gentlemen.
to say that one of the reasons I'm interested in the topic, of course, is Julie and I are in an interracial marriage. We've been together for 24 years. So she is a white woman from southern Missouri, and I'm from New Jersey myself. And the other design, so Julie's going to actually design business cards for me and do a new layout. So it's going to be a different look. But also, what I'm aiming to do is to set up the site in such a way so you can type in a scholar name and get all the resources that scholar or author has put together. So sort of like a true database at the back end. So people will just be able to type in, for example, Kip Fulbeck, and they'll see all his books or his articles. You can sort of do that now, but it's not in a really organized format.
So I could even type in my name, and anything that I contributed would appear.
Yes, you can type in Mike Peden, and you'll find.
Because I just can't get enough of myself.
Okay. So yeah.
Okay. Now you mentioned how people were learning about a database that did not exist, and yes, I know this is not chicks chatting, but we're doing the best that we can, H. Duro. But what have you learned in particular? Because you've collected over 1,000 posts, and I imagine that you read a lot of them, you've been doing a lot of research. So what have you learned about this experience so far that you would not have known about had you not pursued this site?
Well, I did not know the history of so-called mixed race people in America. The fact that we're all pretty much racially mixed, if you want to use the word race. And the concept of racial mixing in the Americas started at least 500 years ago. So that's one of the most amazing things I've discovered on the site is the history. It goes back very far. Our founding, all the countries in the Americas were mixed race societies from the beginning, from the get-go. So those are the many amazing things I've discovered. Also, if you're going to look at the site, you'll notice that there are lists on categories on the site. There's law, there's sociology, there's identity development. So there are different sections. My most favorite one, I guess, is history, as I mentioned before, and that's totally fascinating.
It definitely. I've visited the site a few times, and it is a fascinating thing to experience. Now, you mentioned how this has been going on for some time. On the press release, you said it's been occurring in the Americas for over 5 centuries. And so how did you find out about that? Because it's not something that I don't think a lot of people know about, and perhaps you have some insight?
Well, as I started posting the books, I read the abstracts. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read every possible book that I could pick up. But
That's okay. We won't hold that against you.
That's okay. I have, I picked up books. Occasionally I get to read them. On several occasions I've met with authors in person, and that's been really wonderful. So, yeah, those are the things that I try to do. The reason I know about the history, is several books have mentioned 500 years of history. I think there's articles. There's Werner Soller's book about the mixed race people in America. There are so many out there. One of the most fascinating anecdotes that I picked up recently is an article about the Lovings. Of course, we all know about Richard and Mildred Loving, and there was an article describing the fact that the county that Mildred and Richard Loving lived in before they got married was Caroline County, Virginia, and it was known as Passing County, USA, because there were so many Black Americans of fair skin they were confused for being white, which indicated to me that this has been going on for a very long time.
Wow, and before we move on, there's a couple quick things I want to mention. Heidi Duro is with us today, even though she's not hosting. She will be on National Public Radio, NPR. I'm guessing it's to talk about the book.
Oh, congratulations.
Or in some capacity. So, yeah, let's give a congratulations to her, and especially for her book, which she spent a long time putting together. And it's a great piece of work. For those of you who just tuned in, The Girl Who Fell from the Sky, I read it, and I enjoyed every page of it, and I was disappointed when I finished and I was left with this mystery about the future of the characters, but I won't give away more than that. And there is a question from one of our listeners coming from Jay Cates, and she wants to know, are you finding that historians of multiracialism are mainly multiracial themselves, or who are the contributors to the scholarly resources, is what she's looking for?
Well, what's interesting, there's an old saying, and I actually got that from this show, is either Fanchon or Heidi. They said, you study who you are. And I discovered that many of the researchers are themselves multiracial, and would consider themselves multiracial. And I would say that's when you talk about the field, the disciplines of psychology and sociology, I think it's a very high number. I would say vast majority. When you get to other topics like history, I think it's probably, maybe 50-50. I have not done a scholarly survey on that, but I just, that's what it seems like. And occasionally, I'll go to a scholar's discourse or the article, and of course they'll have a personal anecdote that will explain that, they grew up and they're giving their life experiences, and they mention the fact that they see themselves as mixed.
All right, and there's another question coming in, this one from user Blarabian, who was one of our newer friends who've joined this community. Thank you for tuning in for today's show, Blarabian. And what she wants to know is she thought it was pretty much known that there was an entire history of what she calls mulatto passing in the United States. Now, she explains it's the way mulattoes navigated both cultures, and I'm quoting her words. I know mulatto carries some negative connotations, but so we do want to get that out there. And so perhaps, is it known, or what are you trying to tell us?
Well, people can learn things and people can forget things. So that's something that's common throughout all civilizations in history. Yes, that was certainly known, especially in the 20s. I find that the 1920s was a very fascinating period because it was a time where in the United States lynchings were sort of at their peak. And as a consequence, people who could pass for black pass for white did. So passing was sort of at its peak. Also, at the same time, there was the pseudoscience called eugenics, which came into vogue in the 20s. And I
think it was World War II. It was also exercised for some time.
Well, particularly in the middle of the 20s, particularly. And then, there was just there was sort of like, use the term perfect storm. So about that time in 1924, the Virginia legislature passed the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. And all those things kind of came together to create this whole milieu where people tried to, passing was at its peak. And that's, that's pretty much the history. And, of course, many of the leaders of black organizations, including the NAACP, were themselves very, very fair-skinned and often passed for white. And that allowed them to do certain things, like the first president of the NAACP, Walter Wright, could go to lynchings and report back and wasn't discovered because he was so fair-skinned.
So it's almost like a way of spying in that sense.
Yes, and simultaneously at the same time in the 1920s, there were riots in England because England was a place for, the port cities in England were a place where a lot of African sailors had gone to live, and of course they had relationships, and there were riots particularly because of the relationships between black men and African men and white English women. And at the same time, after those riots, the British people wanted to know what was going on, and at the same time there was a woman named Muriel Fletcher who created this report called the Fletcher Report, which essentially demeaned people of African descent and people, especially people who were mixed. And her report used a term called half-caste. And half-caste, which of course was a term that was used by people who were British and Indian, but it essentially sort of established itself in the British lexicon, meaning people who were of black and white descent. And sort of because the eugenics movement was going on at the same time, it sort of it was just very, very demeaning towards people who were mixed.
Okay, I do have one question, but before I get to that, I will let user KRJS1908 come on. She isn't able to log in from her computer, but she has called in, and so let's put her on and have her say hello. And
hi, KRJS.
Kendra, you're on now.
Hey, I didn't even know you were really going to do that.
I'm a man of my word. When I say I'm going to do that, I will. And so do you have any questions or comments for Stephen Riley? Because if you made the effort to get here, I feel we should at least acknowledge it.
Well, I think that's great, and I'm so glad to join. And, Stephen, it's really good to actually know your name because I always hear you referred to as Silver Spring Steve. So,
that's his username.
It's always nice to get a real name to go with a pseudonym. Okay. It's just very, very interesting, the research that you've done, and it had me actually thinking that I wish I could start something up that said, I'm mixed, but I don't know the background, which is so, so often, and I'm sure anybody else listening has heard these calls where we've had guests on and they talk about how within the black community, the way it's usually masked is my grandmother was very fair, my grandfather was very fair, but that's actually code speak for that person is mixed, but we really don't know how because somehow secrets are just so prevalent in society years past. So it's just so interesting to actually listen to you talk about your research, and it just has me going along the vein of, I just wish there were more out there for people like me who I know I'm mixed, but the actual mix we're not quite sure of. So,
there's, because mixing has gone on for so long, I would have to say unequivocally that people who are black Americans in the United States are probably some of the most quote-unquote racially mixed people on the planet.
Oh, absolutely. I agree completely.
So, there's also the sort of ongoing debate about the multiracial movement. I don't think I'll get into that. People can look on my website and find out information about that. But there's sort of this ongoing discussion or conflict between people who are quote-unquote first-generation multiracial versus people who are sort of quote-unquote multi-generational multiracial, which includes virtually every American from Barack Obama to Michelle Obama. So it's very, very fascinating.
Well, thanks for letting me talk, though. It's great.
Yes, you're welcome, Kendra. And, thank you for joining us. And, it's great you could be a part of this show today. And again, if you'd like to submit a question or call in, you can do the same thing. We will do our best to get you on before the show wraps up. We still have some time left. And so, Steve, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned at the beginning of the show that you listened to Fanchen and Heidi's show and how before then there really wasn't a lot of media or resources to discuss this experience. And since then, we've seen other things pop up. We have the Mulatto Diaries from Tiffany Jones. I'd like to give a shout-out to her. Thank you for joining us today. And there was documentaries and other things going on. So what do you see, what patterns do you see with user-generated content that may not always deal with scholarly material, but still discusses the multiracial, multicultural experience?
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of personal sites out there, and they deal with their personal issues, and I think that that's fine, and I think, but I also think that there are a lot of sites that sort of miss out on the sort of the historical aspect, and I think more and more sites are actually doing that. I was at actually Mulatto Beauty's site, and she talks about her identity and a little bit, and then she does talk about the history, and certainly Tiffany does that. So I think nowadays more people are talking about their personal stories, but also are trying to see how they connect with America's history. So that's I think that's a really good. I think they're really heading in the right direction.
And you mentioned that, and the first thing that came to my mind, we have talked about this off broadcast, but how Barack Obama's election a couple of years ago really spurred an interest in this discussion, in this movement. And so do you think that's an inspiration, or were people just tired of living in the shadow and looking to push forward? Do you have any, do you have any idea on what's causing so many people to now go out in the open?
Going on, I mean, remember the famous golfer who I dareth not speak his name, who won.
He will be competing in the Masters this weekend.
Yes, competing in the Masters.
That's a clue.
So
that's a clue for all of you.
That's part of American history, especially when celebrities come in, become famous. My concern is, of course, celebrities and politicians rise and fall, and sometimes the discussion completely stops, comes to a halt when those celebrities come, are no longer there. But I think one of the things that's really sort of forced this issue to the public spotlight, and it's remaining there, is of course the census. People who are mixed identity are here, and they're not going away. They've always been here, actually, and those numbers will increase. What I am a little bit concerned about, of course, is that I wonder whether or not our society is going to become a post-racial society or a re-racialized society. I think that there is some concern there, and I think we all have to sort of look at societies in Brazil and South Africa to some extent, and make sure that as we start to understand that we're all are racially mixed, that we don't create a society that becomes re-racialized.
And so how do we prevent a re-racialization of society? Because you do read a lot of things in current events right now that suggest the potential is there. A lot of articles with the Tea Party, and some folks out there, I won't mention their names, have criticized it for just being a modern-day racist group. And so how do we prevent a re-racialization of society and try to move towards a post-racial society where, as you point out, where we support the notion that race is ultimately irrelevant because we have mixing going back several generations?
That's a very good question. It's a very difficult to answer. I mean, in some ways, we sort of have to maybe perhaps move away from race as an identity. I mean, we have lots of identities. I'm a photographer. I'm a Doctor Who fan. I listen to classic rock, and maybe we try to do that. It's very difficult. But as long as we hold on to essentialism, and we hold on to things like I'm part this, I'm part Mexican, I'm part Irish, I'm part Black. We still sort of hold on to these notions as if they were sort of pure identities, and there's really no such thing, unfortunately. And I wish I had the answer to that question, but it's very difficult. And I do understand people who create mixed, multiracial identities because in the past they've been ostracized. So I certainly understand that.
Right, and it's something, it's not just the multiracial communities. I mean, it's something a lot of communities considered on the outside are looking into right now, and where there's a concern about whether the culture can survive or not. And so it's definitely something that will be on the forefront for some time, especially as long as Obama's in office, at least based on what I've observed.
Yeah, and one of the biggest questions that I have, I'm a computer geek, and sort of numbers are something that I'm very familiar with. I've often asked the question, well, how do we deal with in the future when mixed race people or so-called mixed race people have children with other mixed race people? Are those children mixed? Certainly by definition, they can't be mixed, or can they be mixed? Because their parents are quote unquote the same. Those are the kind of questions and the contradictions that really I have not been able to answer, and no one seems to be able to answer that for me either. So hopefully maybe the site will help do that.
Definitely, and it seems like that could be the next phase of this discussion, because the last 10, 20 years, the first phase, where after Loving Day passed, you saw a lot of interracial couples starting to come together and then producing multiracial kids who have now grown up and gone on to do things, and now is this perhaps the second phase where now these multiracial people are meeting up, or where do you see this?
Like that's been going on for forever. I mean,
right.
People...
I suppose going after Loving Day, is that when you really? I suppose what I'm talking about is where it really was out in the forefront, where people were actually discussing this in the popular press.
Oh, absolutely. And this is just a fascinating, history. And one of the books I just finished this afternoon was a book by author Victoria Bynum called "The Free State of Jones: Mississippi's Longest Civil War," which is a fascinating book about a mixed race community, pretty much that existed right after the Civil War, right through the 1940s. Fascinating book, and this is going on a very long time, and sometimes it was acknowledged, and sometimes it wasn't.
All right, a couple more things here before we wrap up. There's some comments that I would like to mention. Like Blarabian is talking about perhaps dropping race for culture, because that's what the rest of the world does. She said when she lived outside of the United States or America that her identity was determined by her tribe, her culture, and her religion, and Mulatto Acts Beauty Acts says there's going to be a point where there is no race because everyone will be mixed among each other, and that's something that you're trying to tell people, that people have already mixed for centuries. And so perhaps do you have any thoughts on those points?
Well, I think racial utopia wouldn't necessarily be the fact, be a society where everyone is quote unquote racially mixed. I think it's perfectly fine if all of us look the same 400 years from now. Is that if we treat each other the same. If we treat each other equally is really the key. It's not how we look that's really important. So it's not important that we become mixed. It's important that we move away from race as an identity, I think.
And it's something, it's not just going on here. Even in popular fiction, this point has been brought out too. I don't know if you've seen Star Trek, for example,
yes.
Touched on that. And so, in particular, let's bring that in, I guess, since we're on that subject. When you see popular media discussing this point, in the case of Star Trek, Spock defected to go to Starfleet because he felt offended that the Vulcans did not see him as equal because of his human mother. And so, is that go along with what you're hoping to do, or is that older model, or where do you?
I guess he was sort of the I guess we would call the tragic mulatto model, and I don't want to.
The tragic Vulcan, maybe? Is that what we'll call him?
Yeah.
I
don't want to get too far into the analysis because I'm not a scholar, and my whole point in my site, of course, is to lead people to the scholarship so they can have people who spent their lives studying this issue to sort of answer that question. But yeah, from a non-scholarly point of view, he sort of looks like a person who's tragic, or who's sort of either neither or nor person identity. You can neither identify with Vulcans or humans. So it's certainly a story that we all can relate with, and that's pretty much what people like Park and Stonequist talked about. These were scholars from the 1930s. They talked about marginality and the marginal man theory. So essentially, that's Spock.
And it was something that they had addressed to a point, but in the 60s it was a lot different, where he definitely embraced his Vulcan side, and in the '09 version, he seemed to embrace both sides of it. And perhaps maybe that's what fits with your goal, is that race is irrelevant. That at the end of the movie, Spock was able to find a balance between his Vulcan and his human parts.
Of course. If anyone who's a fan of the original Star Trek series remembers the Beale and Lokai episode, where one was painted. They were black and white characters, and they literally were painted black in one half and white in the other, and they were at each other's throat. And like apparently the differences were that one was painted black on the right side and one was white on the right side. So for those fans out there, you should check out the episode.
And who knows, they might include that. I heard that a sequel will be in the works. So I guess Heidi is saying we might put them out of business or something. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but
it's certainly a pleasure to be on the show.
And so let's go back to reality for a moment, and maybe I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe since you do a lot of scholarly searching, for folks like Tiffany Jones, for other people who contribute stories of the multiracial, multicultural experience, is there anything in particular that you think we should at least consider, maybe not necessarily include just for the sake of it, but something we should consider when we move forward and create new media? Because I know I have another documentary in the works, and we have a lot of new faces coming in and sharing their experience. So what would you like to see from us as we continue to generate content for the audience?
I think we should look, I think there should be a historical perspective, just to remind people that what they're seeing is nothing new per se. I mean, our view is, our the way we look at it's a little different, but this has been going on. I think also when you do documentaries and do podcasts, we also need to make sure that we're really careful not to essentially re-racialize society. So we need to say, yes, I'm a mix, but this is just a gateway to a new future that is non-racial, post-racial. So I would like to see that more and more.
Well, I'll definitely make a note of that, and perhaps when the show returns to normal, maybe Fanchen and Heidi can bring you on as our historical resource during the show. We'll have a new segment, perhaps.
And I would definitely encourage people to just read the discourses of the authors on the site. They have a lot to say, and also tune in to this show because you've got a whole slew of really intelligent people coming on. So doing another plug for the chat, of course.
Yes, we definitely want to put in a plug, especially for the hosts who gave us this opportunity to put on this show, because otherwise there would be no show, and we'd spend our Wednesdays, I don't know, maybe doing something else. Or actually, I guess I probably would start with the 5th season of Doctor Who. I know that just started. Have you seen it yet, or
no,
are you still?
We haven't
no?
seen it yet. We have BBC in America. We haven't seen it. But speaking of the show, I have heard from a source is that author Michelle Elam has a new book coming out sometime in the fall, and she does in fact mention Mixed Chicks Chat. So hopefully, when that book comes out, there'll be a lot more interest, particularly scholarly interest, in the show. So I'm looking forward to that.
And when that article is published, you'll be the first person to post a link, right, on your site?
we'll see. Actually, it's a book, so we'll see. It's good. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, right, and it looks like J. Kate is getting the spelling up for those who are interested, and we'll remember this, so when that Mixed Chicks Chat reference comes on, we'll be looking for the post on your site, and so I guess we're getting close to wrapping up. We're actually over time, but we mentioned the site, mixedracestudies.org, but I guess tell us what to expect when we go on there for those of us who haven't visited.
Mike, before, I think there's a question from Barbarian, I guess.
What is your ethnicity? I think there were some people who tuned in late, and so they didn't get to hear me ask the question, which...
question. And I'm glad that Heidi and Fanchen were able to give you the blessing of the question. I'm a Black American male. Black American male. Married, and I'm also married to a woman who's white American. So.
Yeah, It was an honor to be bestowed with that blessing, I'll say that much. And so it's mixedracestudies.org. And is there anything else that you're going to look into, perhaps, that you want to let us know about?
I just encourage anybody to come to the site and visit and send me your comments and suggestions. I love them when they come in. And what really makes me happy is when people say they learned something they didn't know, or it helped them write a paper or something like that. I really appreciate that.
Well, I'm going to steal their line and say I learned something I didn't know today, particularly about the 20s and the lynch spying, for lack of a better phrase, that you explained to us, which is something that I don't think a lot of people knew about. So,
yeah, definitely check that out. And so, before I go, I don't know how much time we have. I thank certainly Heidi and Fanchen and yourself, and of course I thank my wife Julia, who's been a total support to me while I do all these things, and it's been great to be on the show.
Yes, and one day we'll hopefully see you on Jeopardy, and then you can carry that knowledge and maybe get some funding to support your site. Who knows? And you definitely have the expertise.
Certainly look forward to seeing you and a couple other people who are only voices and bits to me at the Mixed Roots Film and Literary Festival coming up in Los Angeles, and really looking forward to that.
Yes, and so before we go, we will mention that one more time. If you want to learn more about the Mixed Roots Film and Literary Festival, it's in its third year. You can join us at mxroots.org. That's mxroots.org. And to find out who's on next week, well, actually, Tiffany Jones is going to be hosting next week, or guest hosting, and so that will be an experience. I know I'll be tuning in for that. Are you going to, Steve?
I'm certainly going to turn into that. Of course, Tiffany and her fascinating interviews. Of course, the interview with a famous artist, a famous author. I won't mention name, Heidi DeRoe, is currently on her site. So I recommend everyone go there and look at the site.
Yes, especially if you've read her book, go watch the interview. It's terrific, and I think I agree with you, Steve. Even if not everyone else is on board, she is going to be a famous author before this year is out. So again, tune in next week at 4 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, to listen to Tiffany Jones make her hosting debut for Mixed Chicks Chat as Heidi continues her book tour across the country. Thank you for joining us, Steve. It's been a pleasure, and who knows, if as long as we don't kick them out, maybe we'll be asked to guest host again.
Oh, certainly. I'm looking forward to it. I certainly, if I'm asked, I'm more than willing to be on.
All right, so that does it from here. Again, I'm Mike Peden, and I may not be mixed, but I'm definitely a friend of the Mixed Chicks Chat community and a follower of the multiracial experience. It was great to be a guest host today, and I'm especially grateful that I did not have the reaction that Johnny Carson's guest host jokingly said they got when they hosted. I can explain that to you a little later on. So that does it for this week's edition of Mixed Chicks Chat. Tune in next Wednesday for Tiffany Jones. And until next week, this is Mike Peden. So long, everybody.